Good afternoon, everyone. We want to welcome you to this conversation today around the topic hunger, food insecurity, human dignity, and community vulnerability. I'm with the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. The Religious Freedom Institute is a 501c3 committed to achieving broad acceptance of religious liberty as a fundamental human right, a source of individual and social flourishing, the cornerstone of a stable society, and a driver of national and international security. We're thrilled to have Jeremy Everett with us today. Jeremy's a good friend, professional colleague. He is the founder and executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Prior to launching that collaborative in 2009, Jeremy founded and served as the executive director of the Texas Hunger Initiative, a capacity building and anti-hunger project within Baylor University. The Baylor Collaborative has 7 regional offices with over nearly 100 staff, interns, and research assistants. They've assisted local community efforts in increasing hundreds of millions of additional meals to Texans since 2009. Prior to THI, Jeremy worked for international and community development organizations as a teacher, as a religious leader, community organizer, and as a farmer. Jeremy, we're thrilled to have you with us today. You're recognized in your field as an expert. You've authored or contributed to a number of works, most recently released last year. The title of your book, I Was Hungry, Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis. We congratulate you on that release. We welcome you today. It's so good to have you with us.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here. I'm grateful for all the work that the Religious Freedom Institute does, both domestically and globally, and for the partnership that we've been able to have with RFI as a university. I know it's been really an important component in our undergraduate and graduate education, particularly with our work there in DC as a university. And so grateful to be on the webinar with you all at RFI. And then, of course, you, David. David has been a good friend, both to the cause as well as to me. And so grateful to be able to sit down with you and have a conversation this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Let me just invite our guests as we walk through this. Jeremy and I know each other well. We're going to have a conversation. Who knows exactly where it will go. We like each other and enjoy being with each other. And I always learn a great deal from Jeremy every time we have a conversation. But I want to invite you as guests in the private chat box as we go through this webinar today. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type those in. We're going to leave a little time for Q&A at the end, and we'll try to address your questions. But Jeremy, let me just kind of begin our discussion with a kind of a general conversation. I mean, why food insecurity and poverty? Tell us about the Baylor Hunger Collaborative on food and poverty and what it is you do. And then kind of related to that, what were the driving factors that led you to this work and what experiences prepared you?
Well, that's a great question. You know, we at the collaborative, we really work in 3 areas. So we work in research and innovation, and then in public policy work. And the way that, you know, when I was doing community work for the previous couple of decades prior to working with the Texas Hunger Initiative and now with the Baylor Collaborative. And one of the things that we found is that when you're working on issues of hunger and poverty, oftentimes community-based organizations work purely as a local, address it purely as a local issue, or our advocacy partners in DC sometimes, focus on the policy component of it. But oftentimes when you're trying to address these big social issues purely from one specific angle, it's like trying to address internal bleeding with a topical cream. It doesn't matter how much cream you put on your body, you're not going to stop the bleeding. And these issues are systemic in nature. Certainly we're seeing that right now due to the pandemic, due to the equity issues that are on the forefront of our culture. And so you really have to work on a local, state, and federal level, if not a global level, all simultaneously. And so it was with that impetus that we decided to create this particular model at the Baylor Collaborative. But in order to do that well, if you're going to address a systemic issue, it really needs to be informed by research. So what is rigorous academic research suggesting can actually move the needle on issues of hunger and poverty? And then innovation. Those two things really can't be void of each other. You have to have, as Congressman John Lewis said about when he was leading the Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during the Civil Rights era, he talked about having incarnational agents or being incarnational organizers in communities where you lived and worked. And I think it's important that we dwell among the people that we're trying to serve so that we're listening to them, and then that affects our ability to inform public policy and inform research. And so you want research and innovation to really kind of go hand in hand. And then public policy for us, we're a university, not an advocacy organization. And so it's important for us in our relationship with members of Congress or USDA or the White House for us to be able to say, okay, if you're contemplating how to address childhood hunger, here are 3 potential ways to be able to do that, the ramifications of each, so that our members can make informed decisions based in both research and that actual experience on the local level, so that they can make wise decisions on behalf of our nation. So we really try to work in those three spaces. For me, the reason I'm in this space, though, is because of calling. I felt the undeniable call as a college student to the issue of poverty, and the more I spent time kind of dwelling in Christian scriptures, the more I realized that those of us who profess the Christian faith, that our lives are inextricably intertwined with those on the outside of our broken social systems, particularly those living in poverty, both around our country and around the world. And so I knew that for me, that was where I needed to go with my life. I had no idea what that looked like, but I knew that that's why I do what I do.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. And being around you a lot, I've known through the years that this is really personal for you. It's not just a professional exercise. Help me understand that a little bit more. I've had some conversations with you in the past that, after those college days, you felt the need to immerse yourself, right into those communities that are challenged by food insecurity and poverty. And no doubt those experiences themselves, have contributed to your understanding of the vulnerability of those communities, the need and the human dignity of every person in those communities. And so help us understand a little bit of that personal dynamic that moved you into this work.
Sure. Probably the most important graduate education that I received was living for 2 decades in low-income neighborhoods. And I knew after feeling this prompting or this calling that I needed to immerse myself in those realities so that I could see, what was happening in the neighborhood after 5 o'clock and on the weekend, not just, reporting to a community during typical work hours at a nonprofit job. So that was a process that I knew that I felt called to, and that I needed to learn, was so that I could see the community from inside out and ultimately cultivate relationships with families that were living in poverty, many of which had lived in poverty for generations. One of those communities I've told you before that was very impactful for me was San Antonio's West Side.
Right.
My wife at that time, we'd been married for a few years, and our oldest two sons were born while we lived on the west side. And we had a small little home in the community where we were doing community work. And I remember one of our neighbors, typically in that neighborhood, just as a sidebar, we had about 150,000 residents, and then probably another 50,000 undocumented residents that lived in the community. The median income was $19,000 per household, but typically you had 3 generations sharing a home. And so you had very little money, being spread among a family. The best high school in our neighborhood had a 50% dropout rate. And so if, we always wonder what inequity looks like. Well, the entire time that we lived in that community, no college recruiters ever came to that high school, but military recruiters went every week. So if you want to know what inequity looks like, look no further. And so we when we lived in this neighborhood, it's a wonderful neighborhood, and people were really treated us not like we were outsiders, but really incorporated us into their lives. And we had one neighbor who had they had a 2-bedroom home with 19 people living in the home. And so my wife and I at the time just had our oldest son, and we lived in a little 3-bedroom house, and we had central heat and air, which you really want in South Texas, especially during the summer. But our neighbors only had one little air conditioning unit, one little window unit in one of the back bedrooms. And so some nights, my wife and I, when we'd sit down to dinner, we would just talk about how sorry we felt for that family, knowing that they must have bodies scattered all over the house when they would go to sleep at night. And we just thought, man, that's got to be tough. The matriarch and patriarch would sleep in the back bedroom, kind of the grandparents, where they had the air conditioned unit, and any babies that they had would also sleep in that room with them. And so I remember one day I was pulling in from work, and we kind of thought about that earlier that week. And the matriarch of the family was watering the one little rose bush between our two houses, and she waves me over and she says, Jeremy, come talk to me. So I went over there and I talked to her for a little bit. And she said, I want you to know that our family feels so sorry for you and your wife. And we said, well, why is that? And she said, because it must be so lonely living in that house all by yourselves. And, it kind of gave me some perspective of part of the middle class framework that I was certainly bringing to our context.
Yeah, for sure.
But next door to her was a woman, and this story left an indelible mark in my life, and a woman named Lupe. Lupe and her husband had 8 children. They were devout Catholics in the community, and Lupe knew the ticket out of poverty for her kids was education. And so she was a tireless advocate for her kids, not only to graduate from high school, but all the other kids in the community as well. Her husband was the only guy that had a full-time job with one employer on our little block. And so he every morning would go off to work, and then Lupe would send her kids off to school. And then she also was the primary caregiver to her 2 wheelchair-bound parents. And so she would get her parents situated at a local senior center. And then daily, she would make her way around to the local schools to volunteer to make sure that her kids were going to do well in school, as well as other kids in the neighborhood. She was really a legend in the community for her fierce advocacy for education. But she got an ear infection, just like many of us gotten before, but she didn't have any health insurance. And so she waited until it got too painful to bear, and she ultimately decided she needed to go to an emergency room. So she caught a bus and went down to an emergency room, and she sat there all day waiting to be seen, but her name was never called. And so she needed to get back home before her kids got out of school, and she did. But later that evening, her eardrum ruptured. The infection went to her brain. She fell into a coma, and she never woke up. The next day, I was sitting on my front porch with her husband as his kids went door to door on our block trying to raise money for a memorial service so that they could bury their mother. And he just buried his head in his hands, and he said, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Oftentimes we treat families in social situations as if they're only experiencing one aspect of some of our broken social systems. But the reality is, on the local level, it's the same family that experiences food insecurity, that doesn't have access to enough food to live an active, healthy lifestyle, who doesn't have health insurance. They're having a hard time paying rent or paying their light bill or paying for a car payment. They're dealing with all of our broken social systems, and many of them have been dealing with that for generations. And so when we think about motivation, to me, that's motivation. It wasn't uncommon for them to not have food in the house. And if that's one thing that we can do to help improve the outcomes of families like Lupe's, then certainly I think that's our responsibility.
Right. Well, wow, this has such a personal dimension for you. It should really for all of us, as we live and, work side by side with vulnerable communities and vulnerable people every day. I'm wondering, as I think about that, what philosophy and maybe programs have been foundational to the success of the Baylor Collaborative. So if you look at what's really worked, what's, been maybe the central philosophy or a main program, what's really worked for the Baylor Collaborative to address those community needs across the U.S., like Lupe's and others?
That's a good question. I would say, for starters, hunger and poverty, whether it's domestic or global, are too big for any one organization to address by themselves or any one sector. Oftentimes, in Christian communities, we argue about whose responsibility is taking care of people in poverty. Is it the people themselves? Are they to blame? Is it the state or federal government? Is it the role of the church? But the reality is that if we're effectively going to end hunger and poverty in our time or soon thereafter, it's going to require us all working together across sectoral lines. It's going to require the local, state, and federal government to work in concert with nonprofit organizations, faith communities, and the people themselves. That's our only possibility for actually ending these systemic issues, many of which have plagued us, for thousands of years, if not since the beginning of humanity. So I think that our guiding philosophy is that we have to build a collaborative model where researchers are in communication with individuals, and individuals are in communication with local government and nonprofits and so on and so forth. If we're going to actually address this comprehensively, we've launched a couple of models. We have models called like the Hunger-Free Community Model, and that is a model where we build coalitions on the local level. One example of that is what we're doing in Dallas. We have about 350 organizations that are a part of this coalition in Dallas. It's led by the Congresswoman and the mayor's office there, and our team staffs it and does the research and the assessments for it. But they've been able to drive impact on local food systems, making sure that they're producing and growing more food locally. They've put in grocery stores and farms in urban low-income areas. They have increased food for our senior adult population, which, as we know, is a growing population. Transformed how they serve meals to kids through Dallas Independent School District. And so prior to our work there, we would serve about a third of the kids of breakfast before school, and about a tenth of them an after-school meal, and now they're serving 3 meals a day. I think they serve about 300,000 or 400,000 meals daily to kids in Dallas Independent School District. And those are models. So for us, our job is to identify, as a university project, is identify scalable solutions. And so we want to see, is this intervention something that is contextual to Dallas? Is Dallas special, or is it something that we can replicate? Right. And so we've built these coalitions. We now have about 30 active coalitions that we support around Texas, or about 100 around the U.S. that we advise and work with. And it's resulted in hundreds of millions of additional meals to Texas families, and billions of dollars of extra resources coming into the Texas economy through that program. So So those are the kinds of things that we do, that we test out, and we see if this is something that can also be replicated beyond the state of Texas.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've spent a few years with you, walking the halls of Congress and working on some of these issues together in Texas and beyond. And I know that philosophy has really driven you forward, that collaborative model. You and I have spent some hours the last 18 months or 2 years talking about how many of the issues that are deeply rooted in community and society, both in the US and even globally, are not necessarily as disassociated as we might think. And, in terms of religious freedom, and from the standpoint that we look around the world, even here now in the US, of the issue of religious persecution and repression, I'm wondering, in your mind, do you think that philosophy, that collaborative model, might also intersect with those issues of religious freedom?
Absolutely. They are inextricably intertwined, from my perspective. Of course, you and I have had some conversations about this. My father, who is the executive director of the Wilberforce Initiative there in D.C., also working on religious freedom issues, have had some conversations about that. So if you think about this, so let's say ISIS is going into northern Iraq, right? What's the first thing that they do? They burn the fields. They burn all the food that's available to a given community. If you think about what's happening with the Boko Haram in Nigeria, what are they doing? When they go into communities, they're decimating these communities, and widespread. Most of the communities that are adversely affected were already experiencing, higher rates of hunger and poverty, maybe than other communities. But certainly, if they weren't before, they certainly are afterwards. So when we see religious intoleration at an all-time high in some of these locations around the world, we're soon to see poverty and hunger follow. So if you think about that, then you wait a generation. So you think about a lot of what's happened in Afghanistan, and why has Afghanistan been a place where we've had so many terrorists that have come out of some of those communities? Well, our interventions, though certainly maybe not intentional, but our interventions have certainly caused and created a good bit of animosity and created a good bit of poverty. And so if they see us as the enemy, then they're more likely going to join somebody that says, hey, come join our cause. We can provide for you and your family, which is a part of that recruiting model. And so, I mean, if somebody's going to be easily cultivated to an ideology that is a dangerous ideology that's going to be harmful to everybody involved. But we certainly see these issues being intertwined, particularly in a global environment right now, with COVID-19, on the doorsteps of entering into the southern hemisphere. I think that's certainly something that's sending off alarm bells. Just seeing how interrelated so many of these issues are. So, when you think about addressing food insecurity, oftentimes we think about it from the standpoint of, is this a humanitarian intervention? But it certainly it is. But we're also seeing it as an intervention to promote security, both our own national security, but also the security of families that live in these war-torn areas where religious intolerance is either on the cusp of becoming violent or already, in the throes of experiencing violence for a long time. So by intervening in this particular way, you're able to help both endear people to a different ideology, but also provide for them in such a way that they're not left with only one option, which is oftentimes to join these violent groups in order to provide for themselves or their families or their own safety.
Yeah. Jeremy, you mentioned one specific area of the world that I have some familiarity with there in the Middle East. and in Iraq and the actions of ISIS. I was able to spend about 3 days last May 2019 with Monsignor Thabit in the Nineveh village of Karamles. And his town had been overrun. The historic church more or less vanquished on the heels of the 2014 ISIS attacks. And I remember talking with him at length during those days that I was there last year about the attacks on the church and what the biggest need was for the church. And there in that historic church in Karamles, there's about 100 farming families. And he said where we were struck the most was the destruction of our fields and our farms. And it was a way that ISIS had depleted the strength and really struck at the heart of the community, the Christian community there, to make them especially weak and vulnerable. You know, and it began to occur to me even more that many times the attacks on ethnic and religious minorities come in different forms. And here at the outset of that crisis, as we've seen since, even 2016, 17, 18, and even some occurrences in 19, of ISIS and their affiliates burning the fields of communities and striking them at the point of food insecurity and poverty, really as a means of religious persecution and repression. So I compliment you on being aware of that intersection between these issues. Let me bring the conversation a little bit back home at this point. We've received so many reports since the middle of March about the enormous and the tragic impact of the pandemic upon food insecurity in the US and across the world. Because of your expertise and your track record, you've been asked to serve as a first responder with schools in the US during COVID-19. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how expansive the need really is due to the pandemic and how the Baylor Collaborative has served as a first responder?
That's a great question, and that is, I appreciate you sharing your story about what's happening in northern Iraq. It is a tragedy that is hard to comprehend. The level of pain and destruction that has happened in that region over the past 2 decades, and our hearts both go out to them, but also we want our policies to go out to improve their situation. And I think that when we look at the whole pandemic situation, we're some of the estimates of global famine are by the World Food Program, which is the UN's kind of arm, almost like the USDA almost like USDA is to hunger in the U.S. The World Food Program is to the UN worldwide, and their estimates of actual famine, particularly in the global South, are very, very high right now. And so I think our thoughts and prayers and policies and procedures all need to go out to them in this time. Here in the U.S., so I had an opportunity to serve on a congressional commission called the National Commission on Hunger from 2014 to 2016. And so it was a 10-member bipartisan commission. Our job was to essentially find out, what was the cause of food insecurity in the U.S., why were people experiencing food insecurity, which is essentially the technical definition of hunger. Essentially it means that you don't have enough food to live an active, healthy lifestyle. Very low food security means that you're actually not, that you're missing meals on a regular basis. And so they want us to see what research was suggesting, but they wanted us to go out and meet with families who are experiencing food insecurity around the country, and to meet with organizations that were addressing the issue, and then have public hearings where we would hear from anyone that wanted to have their voice heard. By the end of our tenure in 2016, we were finally beginning to see the food security rates get down to pre-recession levels. So essentially what that means is that after 2009, it took us 7 to 8 years to see the economic and food conditions of low-income families improve. So where a lot of our financial standing might have taken a hit from 2009 to 2012, by 2012, most of the economy was back on track. But it took another, 4 or 5 years for us to see low-income communities just get back to where they were before the recession hit. And that means that that dropped food security or food insecurity down to 40 million Americans who are experiencing that, and poverty rates and food insecurity rates typically go hand in hand. So what we knew when this pandemic started to unravel in our country, what we knew is that, and as we saw food insecurity go from about 40 million Americans to 50 million Americans to 57 million Americans to then likely being over 60 million Americans, what we know is that it's likely, because this has been such a more intense economic disruption to the entire system than even 2009 was. What we know is that many of these communities are going to be digging their way out for 5 to 10 years. What we also know through our work with both with USDA as well as the Commission and our field offices is that many of our interventions to address hunger, whether that's child hunger or adult hunger, are targeted towards people who live in urban environments. But rural America is still very large. Half of Texas, for example, still lives in rural communities. So we knew that we had tested out a program in partnership with USDA last summer where we recognized that when kids were getting out of school in high poverty rural areas, they were getting out of school in the summer, that they did not have access to a USDA summer meal program because they lived too far away from a school or any kind of place that could provide some kind of a congregate meal, which USDA requires to be a part of their summer meal program. So we knew if we couldn't get the kids to the meals, we had to figure out a creative way to get the meals to the kids. So we partnered with USDA. We identified 20 school districts in East and West Texas, about 4,000 kids, and had a 10-week trial run where we mailed them a box of food, essentially 10 meals and 5 snacks per week. That would be the maximum that they could get from a summer meal site if they lived in an area that provided summer meals. And so in that trial run, we served about 485,000 meals and snacks to kids during last summer's little, what we call the program Meals to You. And so USDA came back to us. They were very pleased with how the program went. We have an academic evaluation being led by a team of researchers at the Urban Institute there in DC. And they came back to us and they said, hey, can you expand this program to include some tribal communities in New Mexico and Alaska? And of course, Alaska is a whole nother definition for rural, but we said certainly. And we were excited and teeing up to work on that particular issue. But when the pandemic hit, we got a phone call from USDA and they said, is there any way that you could stand this up nationwide immediately? School districts are beginning to close all around the country, and they're likely going to all close for the duration of the school year. And we've got to get our kids food. And so we called our vendors at McLean Global and called a few others at Chartwell's and PepsiCo's Food for Good program to see if this is something that they could come alongside with us and build a public and private response to address the issue. And they felt like that was something that they could stand up. And so in partnership with USDA, we launched that program in March. And we now have about 300,000 children that we're serving several meals a day to in 40 states and a couple of territories. We even have a school district in Alaska that is 350 miles from the nearest road system.
Wow.
And so we've We've done a little over 20 million meals as of last week to these kids. And so that's the kind of thing, and we're built for that. Our job is to identify what is scalable, and we identify this particular program as a potential scalable program. Of course, we had no idea and no intent to scale it this quickly. And so it's been an all hands on deck experience, but those are the kinds of things that we're looking at to intervene.
Well, and I take away from that, Jeremy, the value of the collaborative model. Again, I mean, you could not have done that. You couldn't have achieved that. You couldn't have served 20 million meals to students since March without a collaborative model that had been proven and worked.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It really requires, and that's where I feel like we miss out. We spend so much of our time in DC bickering over whose job, whose responsibility is. We're always trying to advocate responsibility, so Congress wants to make, addressing hunger the church's job, and the church wants to make it, somebody else's job, and the private sector somehow oftentimes gets a free pass. And but the reality is that we've got these great institutions in great sectors, many of which are doing work better than any have ever done in the history of humanity. I mean, last night we were on a Zoom call with our church with a former member who lives in Rwanda. And she was on the Zoom call with us, interacting with us just like everybody else was. You think about the logistical capability of what UPS is trying to do right now, or Walmart, or Amazon. It is tremendous. And so we need to leverage the private sector to come alongside nonprofit organizations and universities and the public sector. But when we do that, and we're able to lean into what we're all good at instead of just our deficiencies, we're able to do some tremendous things that none of us could do independently of each other. And so this has been a great kind of example of that work. And so we're thrilled and flattered to be asked, and glad that things are going well.
Well, and again, this kind of just makes me think outside the silo of just food insecurity and poverty to religious freedom. You talk about the collaboration between, the private sector and NGOs and churches and all of those parts of society that must come together to address this need of food insecurity. And I'm prompted to think that overlaying a model that's similar on addressing here in the United States religious freedom repression, actually bringing individual churches together with the NGO community, building a collaborative model with the private sector that understands the important elements of our founding principles, can be a way of addressing these multi-contextual issues in which religious freedom is also one of those. And certainly that's applicable on a global scale. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I really feel like for any of the major social issues that we see today, I feel like that's the only way forward is to build, essentially public and private infrastructure. It's not just a one-off kind of project, right? And so we all have kind of these one-off examples. Even Meals to You in some ways could be a one-off example, but you really have to build public and private infrastructure around these particular issues if you want to drive social change. And that has to happen on a federal, state, and local level, and for you all, especially on a global level. And so, and it's thinking about, I think there are a couple of key ways to be able to move that forward. One is to recognize that one political party is not gonna be able to achieve the ends that you dream of. So if everybody in your network, and I'll point fingers at the hunger community. The hunger community has for a long time aligned itself largely with the Democratic Party to be the purveyor of positive policy in its space. But the Democratic Party by itself is never going to achieve the policy dreams that we need to help reduce hunger and poverty on a local level. It's going to require both parties. So I think so when you think about who needs to be at the table, well, there are naturally going to be some conservative leaning organizations and naturally going to be some progressive leaning organizations when you look at the issues of religious liberty. But all of those sides have to be at the table. That's one thing that, what you all have built with the Religious Freedom Roundtable is envious. I think that could be a great tool and probably is a great tool for you all to work together. But that can't be void, to your point, of the local community, because the local community ultimately needs to be educated on these issues and help you drive change, because they're the ones that bring the energy and the vitality to these issues and help make them a priority, particularly with members of Congress. If policy ends are part of what you're targeting, then you need the energy and from an educated, engaged faith community, particularly around religious liberty issues, that can help you drive that change. So, I think that it has to be all these different sectors. And so sometimes you don't think about the private sector. And I'll give you one example. So we work a good bit with the migrant crisis in Central America. Here we have offices on the Texas-Mexico border. We've been dealing with the child hunger crisis and kids coming into the state of Texas for a decade, long prior to a lot of the communication that we've heard most recently about children coming in from Central America. The director of our regional office in South Texas ran the Honduran Red Cross before she came to us. So we are steeped into that particular space. And so if you think about, well, what do we need to be able to help prevent kids from coming over? Well, they need to be able to be safe and secure and have job opportunities and educational opportunities back home. And so who has a vested interest in that? Well, of course, the nonprofits do. Of course, the federal government does. Of course, their state governments do. But also, we have a lot of companies that are deeply rooted in those communities. If you go to Guatemala City, you will see a Pizza Hut and a Kentucky Fried Chicken. All these Yum Foods companies, you'll see them everywhere. PepsiCo has operations everywhere. So it's in their vested interest to also be at the table to provide a safe and secure Central America. Likewise, when you think about these religious liberty issues, it's in the same. You're going to have companies that it's going to be in their best interest to see religious liberty and security emerge as priority issues in many of these regions, because we have companies that are multinational with deep roots there.
Yeah. Well, I want to tag on to one thing you mentioned there. And before I do, I just want to encourage anyone in the audience. Now's a great time, if you have questions, to jot them down in the chat box. We're going to continue to chat, but we'll take note of your questions as they come in if you'll record them there. So please do that. Jeremy, you mentioned a key word, as you were talking just now, bipartisan. And, if I were trying to think of issues that are bipartisan and, that can be owned by neither side, but call for the commitment of both. It's food insecurity, it's hunger, that issue, and the issue of religious freedom. That's an issue for everyone. These are needs to be addressed by society at large. And as I recall from your service on the National Commission on Hunger, that commission was a bipartisan commission. It was made up of individuals, leaders across the nation from different political persuasions. They would not agree on many things, but you came together on this commission. I'm wondering, as you think back on that, other than the report itself, what was the most important outcome of the commission as you look back on your service there?
That's a great question. Uh, I think part of what was interesting. So for the first year of our commission, we were mainly meeting in DC. We would meet monthly there in DC, and people, our commissioners would fly in from wherever they were in the country to be able to spend several days together each month, and we bickered a lot. If you had an R by your name, then everything somebody who had a D by their name said you disagreed with, and vice versa. When research was presented throughout that first year, we often argued over the results of the research. And so we knew that we were committed to coming up with consensus recommendations. We knew that one of the most prophetic things that we could do as a commission was to come up with a set of consensus recommendations, even if we could only come up with two. But we also really quickly realized that we weren't going to achieve that around a conference room table in DC, that we had to travel to these communities and visit with families together. We needed to hear from somebody who was experiencing hunger and poverty, or meet with organizations that were addressing it. We needed to meet with them together. And we needed to have these public hearings together so that we were all hearing this information at the same time. But, I think one of the most magical moments through that whole process was there was one guy in particular on the commission that I had a difficult time with. I think our personalities probably just, were two positive ends of the same battery kind of a deal. And we had a difficult time, but we had our third child while I was serving on the commission, and he had his first grandchild. And so on one of the trips that we were on, we had been on a trip for about a week in the southwestern part of the U.S. We were traveling through the desert, and we're trading pictures of his grandchild and my son, and quickly becoming friends. And so he and I are still in touch and stay in regular communication. And once we were able, I think, to go and see what was happening in communities together, and have that opportunity where we were able to cultivate relationships with each other. I mean, we all talk about when DC used to be the place when all the congressmen and women lived there, and their families played sports together and went to schools together, and they lived in the same neighborhoods. We saw a lot more willingness to be bipartisan and a lot less willingness to throw somebody under the bus in the news, because they were going to go see each other that night. Yeah. They were going to the same party that night, or they were going to the same Little League game that night. And so that relationship was too important for them to throw somebody under the bus because of political expediency. And that's all we see now. And so I think if the onus is going to be on the religious freedom community, you've got a lot of great organizations that are based there in DC, and some that are based outside of DC. And I think what's going to be important is that you play well in the sandbox with each other, that you all come together regardless of political ideology, and then go see these places together. Go to northern Iraq to see what's happening there. Go to the Midwest and listen to the voices of concern in the Midwest. Go to the Northeast and listen to the concern of voices in the Northeast, and make sure that you have not only bipartisan representation, but for you all to have many religious communities represented. I think is going to be very important. And so I think if you do that, then I think that you're going to be able to identify where you do have common ground, maybe get past some of the political posturing, and really drive change in a way that we desperately need it.
Great thoughts, Jeremy. And please allow me to just parenthetically put a plug in here for one of our projects at RFI, the American Charter for Religious Freedom and Freedom of Conscience. And you describe, that real and intense effort of reaching across the aisle, of coming together and playing in the same sandbox. with the same objectives in mind. And the American Charter for Religious Freedom and Freedom of Conscience represents that. And we've spent nearly 3 years on that, getting around the table with those that we wouldn't necessarily find agreement on many, many things. But it's a great culminating work that we hope will continue to have an impact. So I just suggest to our listeners today that they might look at that charter on our website. Let me, out of respect to those that are listening, I want to ask a couple of questions here as we get in the waning minutes, and I'll reserve the right to kind of close it down and have closing remarks. But we do have a listener who asked really an interesting question and makes the comment that so many of the problems in society are systemic and they need addressing. And the Baylor Collaborative is very successfully expanding its footprint and expanding your service model. But what about teaching others to do the same thing? And she makes the comment, it's not just about service, but teaching how to fish. And so I want to kind of put that over to you and see what your remarks are on that, because certainly we're better when we teach others to step into those shoes and do the same kind of service.
Yeah, that's great. And it's almost like we're at a university, so we're supposed to do that, right? And so that's a great, I love that question. And yes, 100%. I mean, that is our job. And so part of it is equipping local communities. So like I mentioned, we have 30 or so local communities that are implementing our hunger-free community model in Texas. And then we support communities, about 100 of those communities, through the Alliance to End Hunger and our partnership with them around the U.S. But yes, absolutely. And so we try, one way that we try to do that is we travel a lot. I think I did about 65 trips this year to different local communities with different groups. And typically it's in the anti-hunger and poverty space, not always. The healthcare community, because of social determinants of health, has really emerged as a sector that we've worked very closely with. But also different groups. We've been able to advise on this whole opioid crisis, which might seem a little bit ironic, but our public and private partnership model, when you're thinking about an opioid epidemic, how do you address it on a local level or on a state level or on a federal level? Well, you got to get a bunch of different parties that are not used to working together, both communicating and working in real time, because they really are, dealing with a crisis. And so helping kind of guide that with some of our models. But yeah, that's our job is to be out there and teach and educate with what we're learning. And so we if there are any requests and you would like us to work with you specifically, feel free to contact our organization. Our website is hungerandpoverty.org. And you can reach out to me directly or our chief of staff, Grace Norman, and we'd be happy to work with you. But thank you for the question.
Well, great. I'm going to make one more observation, and maybe this will just plant the seed for a follow-up webinar, Jeremy. But I know through working with you for a number of years very closely that, there have been many that have thought that the work of your predecessor, the Texas Hunger Initiative, was Texas only. And now the Baylor Collaborative has really blown that perception out of the water. I mean, you've, advised and are providing services now in over 40 states. But I also know you personally. I know you have a mind, a heart for the global issue of hunger and poverty. And so as we thought together a little bit today about the intersection between food insecurity and religious persecution and repression, and how that really deepens the vulnerability of communities, it seems to me as though there's a host of issues that are interrelated. We're seeing more and more the patterns of forced human migration around the world. And, I've been thinking for some time now that Again, all of these begin to intersect. The food insecurity, the issues of poverty, the way that these are attacks on ethnic and religious minorities, and then these patterns of human migration that are moving at an escalated rate around the world. And I know you have thoughts on that. We don't have time to get into it today, so I'm going to leave that as a seed thought. Maybe we can follow up in webinar 2. But I want to thank all of our listeners today for participating. I certainly am appreciative that you've joined us today, Jeremy, and we look forward to partnering with you on future projects and other webinars.
Thank you for the invitation, David. It's been an enjoyable conversation, and I will look forward to future conversations.
All right. Well, this webinar was hosted by RFI'S Center for Religious Freedom Education. At the center, we are dedicated to transforming current intellectual and cultural understandings of religious freedom in the United States and around the world. And Jeremy is playing an important part of that. For more information regarding this webinar, please contact RFI'S Center for Religious Freedom Education at crfe@rfi.org. And we'll be glad to follow up with you directly or put you in touch with Jeremy and the Baylor Collaborative on hunger and poverty. Thanks again, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.